My father spent 43 years building everything he had, the house, the land, the savings, with his own two hands. And the moment we lowered him into the ground, my sister had already changed the locks. She had already emptied his bank accounts. She had already told me, with a smile on her face, that I would get nothing. But what she didn't know, what none of us knew, was that our father had been one step ahead of her the entire time. And when that hidden will was finally found, justice didn't just arrive. It arrived with a sledgehammer. My name is Caroline Renee Whitfield. I am 41 years old, and I live in a small town called Harlan, Kentucky, the kind of place where everybody knows your name, knows your daddy's name, and definitely knows your business whether you want them to or not. I grew up in a white clapboard house on Mill Creek Road, surrounded by oak trees, the smell of firewood, and a father who loved his daughters more than anything in this world. My father's name was Thomas Earl Whitfield. People in town called him Big Tom, not because he was particularly large, but because his personality filled every room he walked into. He was a retired coal industry foreman who had spent 30 years working himself half to death so that his family would never have to want for anything. He was generous to a fault, stubborn as a mule, and he had a laugh that could rattle the windows. He raised two daughters, me, Caroline, and my older sister, Deborah Lynn Whitfield, who goes by Debbie. And I want to be fair when I tell this story, because fairness matters to me. Growing up, Debbie and I were close. We shared a bedroom for 15 years. We fought over the bathroom mirror and borrowed each other's clothes without asking. We were sisters in every sense of the word. But somewhere along the way, I still don't know exactly when Debbie changed. Or maybe she didn't change. Maybe I just finally saw who she had always been underneath the surface. Our mother, Ruth Ann Whitfield, passed away from ovarian cancer when I was 16 and Debbie was 19. That loss shattered our family. Daddy never fully recovered. He threw himself into work and into raising us, but there was always a piece of him that had been buried with Mama out at Calvary Cemetery. After Mama died, Debbie took on a kind of self-appointed role as the woman of the house. She cooked, she cleaned, she managed the grocery runs, and Daddy appreciated every bit of it. But over time, I started to notice something that made me uneasy. Debbie had positioned herself as the gatekeeper between me and my father. If I wanted to talk to Daddy about something important, somehow Debbie was always there. If I called the house, Debbie answered. If I visited, Debbie hovered. I told myself I was being paranoid. Sisters get jealous of each other's relationships with their parents, it's as old as time. I pushed the feeling down and focused on my own life. At 22, I married my husband, Danny Marsh, and we moved to a neighborhood about 14 miles outside of Harlan. I got a job as a medical billing specialist at the county hospital. Danny worked as an electrician. We built a quiet, simple, honest life together. Debbie never married. She stayed close to Daddy, closer and closer as the years went on. She eventually moved back into the family home on Mill Creek Road after a brief stint in Lexington that she never talked about. By the time Daddy was in his mid-60s, Debbie was living with him full-time. Again, I told myself it made sense. Someone needed to be there with him. His knees were bad. His blood pressure was high. He had started forgetting things here and there, names, appointments, where he'd left his keys. It was the early, creeping signs of what his doctor would later officially diagnose as mild cognitive decline. And Debbie was there. Always there. I don't want to say it happened overnight, because it didn't. It was gradual, like a river slowly changing course. But over the last 5 years of my father's life, I noticed that my access to him was shrinking. Phone calls would go unanswered and Debbie would call me back hours later saying Daddy had been too tired to talk. When I came to visit, there was always some reason the visit had to be cut short. Daddy needed his nap, or he had a doctor's appointment, or Debbie had errands to run and couldn't leave me alone with him. Once, and I will never forget this, I arrived at the house to find the front door locked in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. I knocked for 7 minutes before Debbie finally opened it, and when I asked why it was locked, she said, "Plain as you please. Daddy needs his rest, Caroline. You should have called first." I had been coming to that house without calling first my entire life. I talked to Danny about it. I talked to my best friend, Teresa, about it. They both told me what I already knew but didn't want to believe, that something was wrong. That Debbie was controlling access to our father, and we didn't know why. I tried to bring it up with Daddy directly on the rare occasions I could get him alone. He would get flustered and confused, and then Debbie would appear in the doorway like she had some kind of radar, and the conversation would dissolve into nothing. Looking back now, I believe my father was more aware of what was happening than any of us gave him credit for. But I'll get to that. On the morning of March 7th, 3 years ago, my phone rang at 6:45 in the morning. It was Debbie. I knew before I even answered it. I just knew. "Daddy passed in his sleep last night," she said. Her voice was flat. Not crying. Not broken. Flat. "The funeral home is already on their way." I remember dropping to my knees on the kitchen floor. Danny came running at the sound I made. He said later it wasn't even a cry. It was more like the sound the air makes when something collapses. He held me on that floor for a long time. I tried to be present in the days that followed. I tried to step up and help plan the service, pick out the casket, choose the flowers, write the obituary. But Debbie had, once again, already done everything. By the time she called me, she had apparently already called the funeral home, already chosen the casket, already started the obituary. I was told what time to show up and what to wear. At the funeral, I sat in the front row and held my husband's hand and tried to say goodbye to the man who had been my whole world. Debbie sat on my other side, dry-eyed, occasionally patting my arm with a hand that felt like it belonged to a stranger. The day after we buried Big Tom Whitfield, my sister sat me down in the living room of the house where we had both grown up, and she told me how things were going to be. "Daddy had a will," Debbie said. She was sitting across from me in the armchair that had always been Daddy's, her legs crossed, her hands folded in her lap. "I had him updated about 2 years ago. I took him to my attorney, Gerald Pitts, over in Middlesbrough." I remember blinking at her. "Okay," I said slowly. "And he left everything to me," she said. "The house, the land, the truck, the savings accounts. All of it." I sat very still. "Everything. Everything." She uncrossed and recrossed her legs. "He left you his mother's china set, and the box of photographs in the hall closet. I'll have them ready for you to pick up by the end of the week." I think I asked her to repeat herself, because I genuinely could not process what she was saying. She did, patiently, the same way you'd explain something simple to a child. "Debbie," I said, "Daddy would not have done this. He would not have left me nothing. That is not the man he was." "People change their minds," she said. "Especially when one daughter is there every single day, caring for them, and the other one can barely find time to visit." That sentence landed like a slap, and it was designed to. I wanted to tell her about every blocked visit, every unanswered call, every locked door. But I could see on her face that she was prepared for that argument. She had probably rehearsed it 100 times. I left that house and sat in my car in the driveway and called Danny. And then I called Teresa. And then I made a third call, to an attorney named Patricia Holbrook, who had an office in Harlan and a reputation for not backing down from anybody. Patricia Holbrook was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated her entire career, and had learned to use it like a weapon. When I sat down in her office and laid out everything, the freeze-out, the locked door, Daddy's cognitive decline, the will that had supposedly been updated 2 years prior, she listened without interrupting, writing notes in a precise, small hand. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "Tell me about your father's mental state 2 years ago, when that will was allegedly updated." I told her everything. The missed names. The confusion. The moments where he'd repeat the same question 3 times in an hour. The time he'd gotten lost driving to the grocery store he'd been going to for 20 years. Was he ever formally evaluated? She asked. His primary care doctor noted mild cognitive impairment in his chart about 18 months before he died, I said. I got a copy of his medical records through a records request. Patricia picked her pen back up. That's a start, she said. But I want to be honest with you, Caroline. Contesting a will is difficult and expensive. Your sister has an attorney. Gerald Pitts is not incompetent. This will not be fast, and it will not be cheap. I'm not doing it for the money, I told her. And I meant it mostly. I'm doing it because my father loved me, and whatever is in that document is not what he truly wanted. I know it in my bones. Patricia looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, all right. Let's get to work. Over the following weeks, Patricia and her paralegal, a young man named Cody, began pulling on threads. They obtained the official will from probate court. They looked at the date 2 years prior to Daddy's death, just as Debbie had said. They contacted Gerald Pitts' office to get the details of the signing. 2 witnesses had signed the will. One was Gerald Pitts' paralegal. The other was a woman named Sandra Combs, who turned out to be Debbie's longtime friend and hairdresser. A friend of the primary beneficiary served as a witness, Patricia said when she called me with this. That's not disqualifying on its own, but it's a flag. They also obtained Daddy's bank records, something I hadn't even known we could do through probate discovery. What those records showed made my stomach drop. In the 8 months before Daddy died, over $60,000 had been withdrawn from his savings account in cash. 43 years of a working man's careful savings steadily drained away. The withdrawals had begun around the same time Debbie had taken him to update his will. Patricia called this a pattern consistent with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I called it what it was, my sister stealing from our father while he was too confused to understand what was happening. We filed to contest the will on grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. The legal machinery began to grind slowly forward. It was Cody, Patricia's paralegal, who found it. He had been going through a box of Daddy's personal papers that I had retrieved from the house during an authorized visit. A visit Debbie had tried to prevent and Patricia had legally compelled. The box was mostly old utility bills, Christmas card lists, receipts for farm equipment repairs. The kind of paperwork that accumulates over a lifetime and seems like nothing. At the bottom of the box, tucked inside a manila envelope that had been sealed with electrical tape and labeled in Daddy's handwriting for Caroline, private, was a document. It was a holographic will. That means a will written entirely by hand, in the testator's own handwriting, signed and dated. In the state of Kentucky, a holographic will is legally valid without witnesses or notarization. My father had written it 14 months before he died, more than 6 months after the typed will Debbie had him sign with Gerald Pitts. A later will supersedes an earlier one. That is the law. I sat in Patricia's office and held the pages with shaking hands and read my father's handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed my birthday cards every year, that had written me notes in my school lunchbox, that had spelled out my name since before I could read. I am Thomas Earl Whitfield and I am of sound mind, and I want to set things right. That's how he started it. He wrote that he had realized what was happening with his savings too late to stop it, but not too late to make it right. He wrote that he knew Debbie had guided him to a lawyer and guided his hand to a document he had not fully understood. He wrote that he was sorry he had not been stronger, had not seen it sooner, had not protected the daughter who came to visit and found the door locked. He wrote that he wanted the house, the land, and whatever remained of his estate to be split equally between his 2 daughters, 50% to Caroline Renee Marsh, née Whitfield, and 50% to Deborah Lynn Whitfield, because despite everything, she is still my daughter, and I am still her father. He wrote, Caroline, I know you never stopped coming. I heard you knock. I cannot fully describe what it felt like to read those words. I can tell you that I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was sitting in the hospital the night Mama died. I can tell you that Danny held me in the parking lot of Patricia's office for a long time. I can tell you that the words I heard you knock have not left me since. The legal process that followed was not simple. Debbie and Gerald Pitts challenged the holographic will, arguing that Daddy had not been of sound mind when he wrote it. But here is the thing about a holographic will written 14 months before death, in clear and coherent handwriting, with specific and detailed instructions. It is very hard to argue that a man who wrote those words was not capable of writing them. We brought in a forensic document examiner who confirmed the handwriting was consistent with my father's documented signature across decades of records. We brought in a geriatric psychiatrist who reviewed Daddy's medical history and testified that while he had experienced cognitive decline, there were periods during which he retained full legal capacity, and that the date on the holographic will fell within what she assessed as a lucid period. Debbie's attorney fought hard, but the holographic will was ruled valid. The estate was ordered to be divided equally. The house on Mill Creek Road would be sold, and we would each receive half the proceeds. The missing $60,000 from the bank accounts became the subject of a separate civil action, and eventually, a criminal referral to the county prosecutor's office for investigation of financial exploitation of an elderly adult. I did not want to see my sister in handcuffs. I want to be honest about that. I did not pursue the criminal referral myself. The prosecutor's office made that decision independently based on the evidence. But I also did not stand in the way of it. Justice served Deborah Lynn Whitfield pleaded guilty to one count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, ordered to pay restitution of $32,000, the amount the court was able to specifically trace and document, and she received a formal reprimand that will follow her record. She did not go to prison. I have complicated feelings about that. But she also did not get to keep everything. And our father's real wishes, the wishes he had taken careful, secret steps to preserve, were honored. The house on Mill Creek Road sold in the fall of last year. I used my share to pay off the last of Danny's truck loan, put some into savings, and make a donation in my father's name to the Harlan County Food Pantry, where Daddy had volunteered every Thanksgiving for the last decade of his life. I kept his mother's china set, the one Debbie had grudgingly offered me in that living room the day after the funeral, thinking it was all I'd ever get. And I kept the box of photographs. And I kept the holographic will, in its manila envelope with the electrical tape, in a fireproof box in our bedroom closet. I kept it because sometimes, on a hard day, I take it out and I read those last lines again. Caroline, I know you never. If you are watching this video because you are going through something similar, if there is a sibling who has isolated a parent, who has positioned themselves as the gatekeeper, who has told you that you'll get nothing, I want you to know a few things. First, document everything. Every blocked visit. Every unanswered call. Every conversation where you were told your parent was too tired. Write it down with dates and times. Text your concerns to someone you trust, so there's a timestamp. This documentation matters more than you know. Second, get an attorney who handles estate litigation and elder law. Not a general practice attorney, not a family friend who passed the bar exam 20 years ago. Someone who knows this specific area of law and has worked these specific cases. Third, do not give up. The probate process is slow and exhausting and expensive and emotionally brutal. There were days I wanted to stop. There were days Danny had to remind me why we had started. But justice, in this case, was real, and it was possible, and it was worth fighting for. And fourth, and this is the most important thing I can tell you. If your parent is still living, act now. Talk to an elder law attorney about guardianship protections. Talk to your parent's doctor about cognitive assessments. Request to be listed on their medical information release forms. Check in on their financial accounts if they will allow you to. Do not wait until it is too late and you are reading a handwritten letter from someone who can no longer speak for themselves. My father found a way, even at the end, even in confusion and illness, to reach through all of it and make sure I knew he loved me. Not everyone gets that. Not every story ends the way this one did. But I stood for him. And if you are out there fighting for your parent, for your inheritance, for the truth, I hope you know that standing for what is right is worth every hard step of the way. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join the Justice Served Tales family. Every week, we bring you stories where the truth wins.